Biology in the mind, structure and function of the nervous system, primarily focused on the central nervous system, brain, and spinal cord. We'll start with a sort of outside-in, top-to-bottom look, again beginning with the brain and the spinal cord. Just a bit of a flow chart of where we are going and ideally where we'll end up. So for a lot of people, this is simply a refresher or a review. I encourage you to just take it in and let it jog your memory. Take notes when you feel necessary. So remember that the brain weighs about 3 pounds in the average adult, and the brain is about 60% fat. The rest is a combination of water and protein, carbohydrates, and salts. And of course, it contains blood vessels and nerves, which include neurons and glial cells. The spinal cord consists of bundles of nerve axons forming pathways that carry incoming and outgoing messages between the brain and the rest of the body. And it contains nerve cell circuits within itself that control coordinated movements and automatic reflexes. A link for these videos are included in this week's module page. View them when you are ready. All right, beginning at the top and moving our way down to the bottom, we will begin with the forebrain, also known as the prosencephalon. There are essentially 3 parts of the brain that I will be discussing: the prosencephalon, mesencephalon, and the rhombencephalon. These areas contain other important structures, and I really want you to not get too caught up in remembering all the minute details. For now, just relax and keep working on holding a global focus, knowing that many of these parts will be referred to in later PowerPoints. Know that each of these areas work together and that no system or part is separate or completely independent of any other. So the forebrain, also known as a prosencephalon, is a key area for processing information. It's related to cognitive, sensory, and associative functions, and also voluntary motor activities. It is made up of the cerebrum, which is the grooves and folds that most of us think of when we visualize a brain. And the purpose of these grooves and folds is to increase area, which increases function. So if you look at a brain of a monkey or a rat, it is less folded than a human brain. The higher up on the intelligence scale, the more grooves and folds there are. The telencephalon is made up of cell bodies, which are gray, and axons, which are white in color due to being wrapped in myelin, which is a protective coating made up of fat. Also in this area is the basal ganglia, the limbic area, the olfactory system, and the hemispheres or the cerebral cortex. The limbic area helps with emotion regulation to both internal and external stimuli, with reactions that are based on individuals' experiences, memories, and associations. So this area contains several structures that will be discussed throughout this and other modules. 2 of them you are likely already familiar with, the hippocampus and the amygdala. The olfactory system is a sense of smell, right? And it takes in information via the nose into the limbic area, which then in turn responds. So another aspect in the telencephalon is that there is communication between both hemispheres, and that is via the corpus callosum, very thick structure that attaches and connects the 2 areas. The diencephalon, which is the thalamus, hypothalamus, epithalamus, and the subthalamus. The thalamus is a relay center between the medulla and the cerebrum, so between the brainstem and the higher centers of the brain. The thalamus helps to regulate what comes in and goes out of the cortex. The basal ganglia is the connector between the thalamus and the cerebral cortex, which acts as a helper in selecting patterns and routines of activity. Damage here can result in neurodegenerative conditions like Parkinson's disease. Now, the hypothalamus controls some basic visceral functions in the body and outflow from the endocrine system through the anterior and posterior pituitary. Going on to the midbrain, or the mesencephalon. This is located between the diencephalon and the pons. It is the smallest division of the brain. The central role here is in motor movement, especially of the eyes, as well as auditory and visual processing. So it's broken down into a couple of different sections. The first is the tectum, the top and back, which contains superior colliculus, which are protuberances that receive input from the retina and visual cortex. The inferior colliculus receives both crossed and uncrossed auditory fibers and projects onto the medial geniculate body, which acts as a relay of the thalamus. Both of these just sit just above the cerebellum and posterior to the pons. The tegmentum, which is front and contains fibers and tracts in 3 different regions. It sits just in front of the cerebellum at the superior area of the pons. So the 3 areas are the red nucleus, the periaqueductal gray, and the substantia nigra. Many of you have already heard of some of these places, especially the substantia nigra when we talk about things like Parkinson's, and because this area regulates motor movement and motor coordination. The red nucleus coordinates sensory motor information. The periaqueductal gray plays a huge role in pain inhibition, and of course the substantia nigra. This is where dopamine is synthesized. The next section is the hindbrain, also known as the rhombencephalon. This has a central role in coordination of all functions necessary for survival. Nearly all cranial nerves originate here. It is composed of 3 divisions. The top is the pons, which contains cell groups which transfer information between the spinal cord and higher brain centers, as well as between the cerebellum and higher brain centers. The medulla oblongata, which is a lot of times what people refer to as the brain stem. This transmits signals between the spinal cord and the higher brain centers. It controls a lot of autonomic functions like heartbeat and respiration. And it contains ascending and descending fiber tracts, as well as the nuclei of cranial nerves 8 through 12. The respiratory and cardiac centers are also situated here. So these 2, along with the components of the midbrain, make up the brainstem. The cerebellum has Purkinje cells and granule cells, and these neurons from the cerebellum, along with the upper motor neurons of the brainstem, travel through the thalamus on their way to the cerebral cortex. The 12 cranial nerves provide input via their associated organs. Some of them also contain motor fibers, as well as connections to output for the parasympathetic nervous system. Each nerve exits at locations in the brainstem, upper aspect of the cervical spinal cord, and the superior aspect of the diencephalon. Their connection to these areas are important to remember as we discuss automatic reactions to smells, sights, and sounds. So the first cranial nerve, the olfactory smell, is afferent. Remember, afferent means sensory. It just takes in information. The optic nerve, the second nerve, cranial nerve, is for sight, again an afferent. The oculomotor, the trochlear, and the trigeminal are all efferent, meaning that they control movement. The abducens is a mixed nerve, meaning that it has both afferent and efferent, as well as the 7th cranial nerve, the 8th cranial nerve, 9th and 10th are all mixed nerves, again taking in afferent and putting out efferent actions. The accessory cranial nerve 11 and the hypoglossal cranial nerve 12 are both efferent, controlling muscles in the posterior lateral neck and then the inferior aspect of the tongue. The spinal cord is the main pathway for ascending and descending fiber tracts that connect the peripheral and spinal nerves with the brain. So it is protected by the vertebrae and the meninges. The white matter makes up the outer layer. The dark matter makes up the inner. It's actually the opposite as it is in the brain. The fibers run the full length of the spine with the lateral extensions making up the peripheral nerves. Two important concepts to remember are the dorsal root and the ventral root. So dorsal, meaning back. These cell bodies are responsible for the transmission of sensory messages from receptors, such as thermoreceptors, which is about temperature, nociceptors, which is about pain, proprioceptors, having to do with balance coordination where we're at in space, and chemoreceptors, which have to do with chemical reactions within the system, neurotransmitters, things like that. And these all coordinate to respond for the CNS, the central nervous system, to respond. Now, the ventral root, being the front, is composed of myelinated axons from motor neurons, including large diameter myelinated axons that innervate muscle fibers and small diameter myelinated axons that innervate fibers within muscle spindles. The dorsal root and the ventral root both exit between each vertebral segment, and again, they have lateral projections. Something to take into consideration is the fact that the cerebral spinal fluid travels down the central canal and up in the meningeal layers. The meninges are protective layers of varying density, with the dura mater being the thickest and strongest and the pia mater being the most delicate. Now there is a third layer, the arachnoid layer, which serves as a sort of mesh or web-like connection between the dura mater and the pia mater. In summary, the brain and the spinal cord make up the central nervous system. The various structures have dedicated but not independent functions, as much of the nervous system works through connected circuits and feedback loops. For now, it's just important for you to remember the interconnectedness of the brain, the cranial nerves, and the spinal cord, along with all the other parts of the body, including the musculoskeletal system, as well as all the other organ systems. Here are some references.